Whatever happened to the original Golden Wind? In my naivete, that question seemed very basic a few weeks ago, but as I stand before you now, or talk to you now I should say, I didn't think I'd find myself in this rabbit hole that I'm currently in. What I thought would be a very short and simple video to explain ended up becoming something much more complicated than I ever could have imagined. Not only am I explaining what happened to the original Golden Wind that was planned, a much darker story with a female protagonist, rising up the ranks to become the mafia boss in a dark and depressing world, and trying to find happiness and trying to uphold justice from literal zero, with a side of extremely interesting historical context of the manga scene, explaining why Araki was so depressed during part 5 in its run and why he hated being a mangaka, on top of why Shueisha and Shonen Jump just quite literally suck as a business. I think you might want to be locked in for this. With that being said, hello, my name is Metas.
あるかもしれない。
Walk with me. So where we have to begin here is with Araki and his life, and especially his life as a mangaka working for Shonen Jump Weekly. Through parts 1 through 4, he would see a level of success never before seen in his life. But with this success comes a major downside. He is now tired. Araki originally planned to end JoJo's at part 3. However, he ended up doing part 4 just for fun, but now is feeling the fatigue. There is no fun anymore. And while any other mangaka could have just ended their series right there and then, Shonen Jump at the time had a problem. It's the late 90s. All of the other popular manga that started in the 80s are over, and JoJo's is the only one left. And since JoJo's works in a way where it can continuously go on forever until the JoJo stars just stop having kids, there really is no ending in sight. So they ask Araki to do it again, and Araki says sure, he did it with part 4, he can probably do a part 5. But unknown to Araki, this comes with some major downsides. Looking at all the interviews chronologically leading up to this point exactly, Araki really hasn't had a problem with Shonen Jump and its editors. However, since now he's basically become the flagship, here's where the problems start to arise. While his main editor tells him to make something more sad and dramatic, it can't be too sad or dramatic, and when it doesn't follow that, he receives a whole bunch of orders to change it from the editorial department. Fix this page, change that line, correct this image, so on and so forth. This is the only time Araki has ever really complained about his editors, ever, so it's pretty significant. And in context, it does make sense. Shonen Jump at this time has nothing. No Dragon Ball, no Orochi Kenshin, no Fist of the North Star, nothing. They only have JoJo's. And since Araki's main editor is saying to make something much more sad and dramatic, and Araki wants to do that, but does it in his own Araki way, as he is the bizarre guy, this leads to conflict because you can't make anything too experimental because it's not safe. We need to make money. Not safe means potentially not making money. Of course, this is the classical case of the artist versus the company, and the choices here would immediately affect Araki. The mangaka fatigue and limited creativity when it comes to making his own manga would start making him think much differently. He feels like anything before part 5 was too long, and that 19 pages are just too limiting for what he's trying to do right now, and being asked to constantly change things or correct things isn't helping either. So much so that when Araki is doing a specific theme for this part, in specific with part 5, being destiny and fate, and how a poor life still means that you can still do justice. That was kind of the whole idea he was going with here. But it seems like Shueisha / the editorial team didn't like that, and it ended up making Araki have a crisis. If he can't write about destiny and fate, he starts to doubt himself. He starts to enter this very dark place and starts questioning why he's even living. Why is he drawing manga in the first place? What it feels like here is this is not a job, this is a lifestyle, and when somebody comes in telling you how to live your life, you might as well just stop living. But Araki does say as long as he has fairness and humanity, he can keep on going. The indomitable human spirit strikes again. Now, if I've done my timeline correctly, which I think I have, we're now in between the beginning and the middle of part 5. At this point with Araki writing part 5, he's having a crisis trying to express the themes of Golden Wind. At this point, he's feeling very limited with his freedom of expression and even starts to question manga as an art form itself, saying that it has reached the limits of its evolution, or that the profit-seeking assholes have really kind of nipped the bud of the art form itself. Till this very day, not even Araki knows the answer to the questions he asked himself all those years ago. Moving from the themes of the part to the initial characters in the story, it is still in a dark place and getting even darker. It is getting so dark, in fact, he is starting to despise it from the very bottom of his own heart. This is where we get the infamous Fugo betrays the group interview. Araki is feeling so sad and depressed at his own characters because to a certain point he thinks they are real, quote unquote, and how he is guiding them is just making him feel just awful, just really, I guess maybe how I would describe it, gross. How Araki would describe it as the sheer thought of it made him sick to his stomach. So I'm hopefully kind of driving the point in with everybody watching this. Araki was miserable. He was hating this development and writing of at least early to mid part 5. But this next bit of commentary, which a lot of people would brush off as just a weird comment, is eye-opening and jaw-dropping. Me being the YouTuber I am constantly looking at Araki and his interviews and what he's saying about stands or characters or the entire manga making process. He treats it as a lifestyle. While some mangaka like Akira Toriyama might be able to develop a Dragon Ball chapter within 2 days, Araki takes weeks at most to develop a storyline. So when I read the quote, "Scold me for not having enough courage as an author if you want, but I began to feel that I hated my profession," excuse me, I truly hated my profession, shows a lot about what he was thinking at the time. Araki never, and I mean never, refers to making manga as a profession or as a job. He always says as a lifestyle or just a way of doing life. So the fact that he is referring it to as a job or a profession means that he truly hated what he was doing at that time. In another way to phrase it for dramatic purposes, he hated his life. The betrayal of Fugo, in retrospect, is his breaking point as a mangaka. It basically starts his journey from this point onward into Ultra Jump and is basically the reason why we have 7, 8, and 9 the way we do now. He hated the weekly process, he hated his editors, or at least the overcomplication of trying to edit everything he's ever doing at any given point when trying to write his manga, that he had to move on. You can tell even looking at part 5, the tone completely shifts after Fugo. The beginning half of part 5 up until that point is extremely dark. There's a lot of dark moments. It is genuinely a lot more different feeling than any other part in JoJo, up until probably 7, I would say, in terms of feel and the sadness and the darkness. But after Fugo, it genuinely feels like a regular JoJo part. You have kind of this whimsicalness with like the part 4 feeling and kind of the group dynamics kind of resembling that of part 3. But before that, you can genuinely feel the sorrow and depression that Araki was writing, and I think the anime captures this pretty well unintentionally. Thankfully, the negative comments in these interviews and commentaries stop. Some point after Fugo, Araki kind of finds the brilliance in his own humanity and is able to cheer himself back up and starts writing positive things again. Intentional or not, he almost feels like one of his characters in this moment, going from his lowest point to his highest point, finding a way out of that darkness, being his own light, as the characters he made were not only bits and pieces of him, but his own companions through that dark time in his life. So with all that historical context out of the way, what was Araki writing during this time? Follow me into the abyss. It's gonna get dark. So the first thing I want to talk about here is with the themes of the part, because with the added context of the background story happening while writing Golden Wind, the themes and the ideas of what originally could have happened change a lot. While yes, the backstory of the main characters are still pretty sad for the most part in the final version of Golden Wind, in this earlier version or prototype version of the story, it can be assumed it was supposed to be even sadder for the main characters. Remember, Golden Wind was supposed to be an answer to a sad JoJo story. So all their family and society trauma was supposed to be even emphasized a lot more in this version, and probably was even supposed to be elaborated even further, looking at some interviews. A byproduct of this would have been a much more heavy emphasis to the audience that destiny and fate play a major role in this part at the beginning rather than the end, like we got in the anime and current manga. In my opinion, I would have probably rather preferred this than what we got. That's because I feel like I would have not related to the characters a bit more, but would have felt for them a lot more, just because I would have just seen this bad life they grew up, and the fact that they still choose to be good people and want to do good actions would have probably got me hooked a lot more on these characters in the long run, at least in my opinion. Araki wanted to depict these themes of deep human grief and sorrow at one's birth and circumstances to really elevate the point at the very end of the story where they find happiness. Honestly, it's pretty genius. And while the current Golden Wind we got does do a pretty good job at that, I feel like this original version probably would have done even better. The reason why I say that is because the even darker moments would have made the moments with light and brightness and happiness even bigger in comparison. That also applies to even the darkness. He also wanted to emphasize that where destiny and fate cannot be changed, this also can have pretty bad side effects to a person, looking at the antagonists and minor villains of this part. This is where I'm going to get a little bit crazy and say, well, yes, we kind of did get that with the Golden One we do have. I feel like the prototype version would have showed it off a lot more. And that's not me being crazy, that's me being realistic, because Risotto had this entire backstory. It was told to us, but we never saw it. What is given to us is a literal perfect example of what Araki was trying to do with the theme of this part. The destiny and fate and the bad situation he was in led him down a dark path, but it would have been immediately contradicted and challenged by Giorno and his group and what they fought for. So it's literally perfect. I would also even emphasize that it wouldn't just be Risotto he would have probably emphasized here with. If he ended up doing it, it would have been for even more characters. I actually heavily assume Diavolo probably had a lot more planned, but just was scrapped just because it was just too risky for Shonen Jump at the time. And like I said a few moments ago, I think this also applies to Giorno and friends with their fate and backstories as well, even their actions concurrently happening in real time with the manga. Araki wanted to write darker scenes for this part in specific. It's just sad we never ended up seeing it. And I do want to talk about this because I feel like it's important. When it comes to the villain side of things, it's not because Araki was second guessing himself and changing things last second, but Araki knows how to do evil. He talks about self-regulation a lot. And to depict that, you can't self-regulate. You have to go full send or no send. He knows how evil works. He talks about it in detail. Evil smokes, it shows no mercy, it sexually assaults others, it stabs people with knives, does incredibly horrible things to people, and even if they don't show that, it is emphasized that they could do that. Araki knows what a villain does. It's actually pretty scary how he knows all of that. What do you do in your free time, Araki? He knows so well that even when it comes to gangster life or a mob life, that even a good gangster still will do these actions, and that was kind of his breaking point. Under all the stress and constant editorial changes and just how he was feeling at the time, when he was coming to that Fugo scene where Fugo was originally supposed to betray the group, it was supposed to be followed up by a scene where Giorno and crew were to execute him mob style after the fight with the boss, to help emphasize the difference between right and wrong within the gang and mobster world, and just how actions have consequences in general within real life. But Araki couldn't do this anymore because he just couldn't deal with the sadness, the depression, the dark tone this part was taking, and the constant limiting and creative freedom from the editorial team upon his work. He just couldn't do it anymore. And this is where we see a pretty major shift in just Golden Wind's writing in general. That is the point where the story just ends up a lot more happier for the most part. It kind of lightens up, is probably what I should say here. Constantly talking about sadness and depression in your story throughout the entire thing seems pretty miserable, so I'm kind of happy that Araki broke himself to where he said, that's enough, I need to do something else. So this is where I have to thank Araki's psyche and the editorial team from stopping his actions. Now, I will say this, I do think some parts should have been pretty dark to emphasize the lighter parts, but making the whole thing dark throughout the entire original planned run of this thing might have been bad in retrospective. Might have been is actually an understatement. It was bad. It was definitely bad. However, being surrounded by all this darkness, there are the lighter spots, and one of the lighter ones that I was so intrigued by, it was probably the primary reason why I ended up making this video, is that of the mythical character that is female Giorno. In my research to answer this question, time and again while looking at interviews and commentaries, this character was brought up several times. What I should say is an alarming amount of times. For a character that didn't show up, a lot of people have a lot of questions about this, and or Araki just brings them up. Using context clues on what was happening around the time with Araki's history is that female Giorno was the first character created for Golden Wind, alongside Pesci for some reason. However, during this early planning stage, after discussing it with his personal editor Horiyoshi, he thought the idea of a female protagonist would be extremely hard to sell to Shonen Jump readers at the time. More likely than not, this was due to there not being any manga in the magazine at the time. So I highly suspect that the only reason why this decision was made was because of it being too risky at the time, so change them into a dude. I also feel like after reading a lot of these commentaries and interviews, Horiyoshi fed into Araki's self-doubt. Around the time, Araki felt like he couldn't draw women, which is kind of common with male artists, so I can't really blame him. But Araki also felt, but does not feel the same way now, that he just didn't see a female character with a stand fighting other dudes. But the fact that he was trying means that he was somewhat interested and wanted to kind of perfect his craft to actually write a good female character, which he would eventually do with Jolene with some motivation from his wife. So I think the same would be applied here. I think he could have done it if given enough time, and the editorial team wasn't yapping in his ear constantly. Later on, he was definitely hating that. So this is definitely marks the beginning of that. Luckily though, while the gender might have been changed, for the most part, a lot of female Giorno's attributes eventually crossed over into male Giorno. The biggest being kind of the gay fashion / gangster motif, and especially gold experience in ability and design. It's very feminine once you start looking at it like this with all the background knowledge on top of that. This is just a personal thing, but I've always felt that even before coming into this video topic, that gold experience just looked really feminine for whatever reason, and I was never able to point out why until reading these interviews and commentaries. The more you know. So I'm guessing the question is, you're probably asking me, and probably even to a further extent to yourself, what would female Giorno be like? And for the most part, in a very non-romantic answer, pretty much the same. Regular Giorno, probably because he was supposed to be a female, was already androgynous to begin with. So the gangster style and gay fashion was the only thing applicable here that he could cross over into the male variant. I know, pretty anticlimactic. However, I also do have to say there is a caveat here. The only reason why he probably ended up becoming androgynous to begin with was because Araki couldn't use his original ideas and wanted to move on forward, which makes sense. You're doing things weekly, you can't really dwell on an idea for too long. So whatever those original ideas were could have potentially changed him slightly to potentially even majorly. Just to add some meta speculation in here, I feel like maybe original Giorno, being female Giorno, was supposed to be kind of like a bossy female. It kind of works with the idea of Giorno just wanting to become a boss of the mafia. So I feel like, a bossy type nature would have been applicable here. What I'm kind of envisioning is some type of telenovela based female cartel leader vibe, which has been done in some Hispanic shows, as guess what, I'm Hispanic and have been forced to watch them, so thank you, Grandma. And to be real, I'm gonna double down on that statement. After reviewing all the history, the lore, the interviews and commentaries, this story was just supposed to be darker in general, so that whole female cartel / female mafia boss type vibe honestly works here with female Giorno. Now overall, which one would I prefer? To be honest, either or, but if we are going for this darker story, maybe this female version of Giorno would have worked here. Side note, by the way, too, the nickname or just the title, the Daughter of God, just being a reference to being the daughter of Dio, sounds raw as all hell, and yes, female Giorno would have been the daughter of Dio. It seems pretty evident that this was supposed to be the case even from the original story. To be honest, in retrospect, I'm actually kind of sad that we never got female Giorno. It kind of sucks that a lot of the editorial team was feeding into Araki's self-doubt about his artistic and writing talents, because I think this honestly would have worked. Honestly, it even makes it worse worse because the fact that they were even doing that was because of money. Remember folks, the color of greed is green. So before I piece all the puzzles together and give you the full story of Original Golden Wind, I do want to bring up some miscellaneous facts that I really couldn't put in the video because I just didn't know where to put them. So here you go. One of the bigger ones I want to kind of point out is one of Araki's inspirations while writing Part 5, that being American gangster rap. Araki uses the example of Doggy Style as he finds it particularly scary among others while developing the hoodlum / scarier feel for Part 5. And for anybody doubting that Snoop Dogg isn't scary, if you listen to Doggy Style and in specific Serial Killer, yeah, you might want to, tweak your eyeballs a little bit when you look at Snoop Dogg, because back in the day, he was kind of terrifying. And I probably also am just going to assume here, but Araki was probably listening to a lot of East Coast and West Coast at this time, because there was a lot of scary stuff within gangster culture at that time to really inspire you. So I'm just going to assume he listened to Biggie, Tupac, NWA, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, just all of them for the inspiration for Part 5. I'd actually even go a step further and say whatever was changed during the original run probably was a lot more American gangster themed. So more American gangster, less Italian mobster themed, if he was genuinely listening to all this music at this time. Also random as hell, he was definitely listening to Wu-Tang Clan. That's like one of his few early rap references he made before even like Part 4. So yeah, Wu-Tang in there too. Araki is definitely a certified hip hop and rap enjoyer. Now, if you believe Araki at this time was just saying stuff and actually wasn't providing substance to what he was saying that he was in a dark place and he was trying to go for a darker story with a more sadder theme, if you don't want to take his mouth for it, take his sketches for that. A lot of his early character designs for most of these Golden Wind characters are really creepy. In specific with Kraftwerk and King Crimson, I don't know what's up with these pictures, but they're kind of giving more demonic vibes than usual. As a whole, Part 5 in general, even in its finished product, has some very peculiar stand designs compared to the rest of the franchise. While every part with stands has like a distinct style, Part 5's feels off compared to the rest of the series. Like all of them have like connecting factors, but in specific with 5, it just feels uncanny. And I think that's specifically done on purpose. If Original Golden Wind was supposed to be darker, I highly suspect a lot of the stands in this part to be even weirder looking than they are now, especially with King Crimson. That guy just looks demonic in this version. And to be totally honest, I might prefer it just a little bit more, and that's just due to the fact that King Crimson's smile now is just a little bit funny looking now after seeing it so many times. But this one's always looked creepy every time I've glanced at it. That aside, I do want to point out one last thing here. Golden Wind's popularity in its current version. From what can be understood, at least within Japan, Part 5 is actually extremely popular, arguably being as popular as Part 3, which is basically the poster boy of the franchise. Araki contributes the success of Part 5 just probably due to the fact of the art style and the class the characters have in this part. However, he says on a side note, if it's not that, it's probably just because how dark and sad and tragic it just is now is what intrigues these people a lot. And if that is the case, maybe Shonen Jump really did jump the gun when it came to Araki's original idea. Just a food for thought there. So with everything laid out, let me connect the story for you. Let me tell you about what the story could have been. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5 Golden Wind would have been a rich, dark, gangster mafia-based story within Weekly Shonen Jump, with its main protagonist, Giorno Giovanna, a young girl seeking to eventually become a gangstar, to become a boss of the mafia, Passion. She would eventually end up meeting Bruno and the rest of his gang, and from there slowly plan out the demise of the current system in place. The gang we previously knew more likely than not has changed pretty minorly to pretty majorly. While we do not know the finer details, what I can assume here is more likely than not a lot of their dialogue and history is probably a lot darker than usual, probably even sadder. For the most part, moving on forward, I don't think a lot is going to change in terms of character arcs and story beats. Maybe more illustrations and manga panels depicting a lot of the stuff happening in real time, but other than that, not a lot here. However, when it comes to villains, this is where stuff starts to change pretty dramatically. More likely than not, Araki would have probably emphasized a lot of these villains' actions, minor or major, with a much darker tone and a heavy emphasis on depicting what they are saying, and or what the narrator is saying, in specific probably Risotto and La Squadra, as I feel like they can benefit the most from this. I also do feel like maybe even Diavolo a little bit could also benefit from it, but it's hard to tell. Because it feels like Araki kind of got the point through with him, but he could have probably added maybe a little bit more in this original version just because it allows for a lot more darkness to be present. After fighting Lasquadra in the early parts of part 5, we eventually get to the boss, and I do think for the most part this probably stays somewhat similar. Now of course we come to Fugo, and of course Giorno has to execute him because he has betrayed Bucciolati and his friend group for Diavolo because he is a traitor. And coming to this point, I actually don't know how the story would play out because a lot of the information kind of stops here, but I would say for the most part, just like the beginning half of part 5, the story would probably still be dark, maybe starts to mellow out after this point, as it's pretty hard to top this, so I feel like the only way you can realistically go with this is just to mellow out, and just for the sake of things, maybe the plot still ends up being the same as it was in the current version we know now, as there's very limited information after Fugo's betrayal. But I would say the idea of accepting your fate and destiny still plays a pretty major role during this part of the story, even in this original version. So with that being said, that's what happened to the original Golden Wind story. A lot of drama, a lot of lore, a lot of history, a lot of facts a lot of people just don't know. Giving my thoughts about it, original Golden Wind in a vacuum seems pretty interesting, but I do have to say for the most part, I don't like it. And I'm very happy that Araki and the editorial team kind of jumped the gun at least a little bit here. Why I'm saying this is because like it just doesn't feel like JoJo's. JoJo's is always something that has like a happiness throughout its entire story no matter the plot, and this one just kind of ruins that at least a little bit. Actually a lot. I take that back. It's a lot because it's just there's no hope or like humanity here that like JoJo's always tries to strive for, and I guess that really is just showing of what Araki's emotions and the editorial team kind of wanted here. But it's good that they kind of restrained themselves because I think it would have led to a very worse product within the franchise of JoJo. In a vacuum by itself, I think it would have done good. It's a very interesting seinen, but as a shonen manga, no, not really. However, I do think some concepts should have stayed. Female Giorno, for example, would have been just a really good thing to add. I just overall think it definitely has a lot more benefits here and leads to a much more interesting character just in general compared to male Giorno here. I also think drawing / illustrating a lot more of these characters' lives and histories would also be pretty cool in general, and I don't think would hinder the plot at all. I think it would just elevate it. So that's the things I would keep. I'm kind of happy we didn't get original Golden Wind, but I'm kind of disappointed that some of the concepts didn't transfer over into the current version that we see now. So with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.